Welcome to the Grizzly Beat, a podcast of Grizzly Times and Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientific experts, managers, Native Americans, writers, and others to share their knowledge, perspectives, and experience. This comes at a time of enormous interest in the grizzly bear's future as the government proposes to remove federal protections, and citizens are asking important questions. We hope the information shared here will help listeners shape their own answers. This is Louisa Wilcox, and welcome to the Grizzly Beat. Today we have with us Tim Bozorth, who spent his 45-year career before retirement as a federal scientist and land manager, most recently as field manager for the Bureau of Land Management in Dillon, Montana. While in Dillon, Tim served for 10 years as the BLM representative on Yellowstone's Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. Tim also worked for the U.S. Geologic Survey and BLM for 25 years as a hydrologist. Tim has a BA in biology from Berkeley. Tim, as the land manager, you worked on many controversial aspects of grizzly bear recovery in an important part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. What do you think was one of your greatest accomplishments, and what were some of the biggest challenges you left to your successors?
Well, I think one of my greatest accomplishments is yet to be fulfilled, and that's dealing with the United States USDA sheep experiment station in the Centennial Mountains and trying to relocate that experiment station in another location that is less critical to grizzly bear recovery. A great many NGOs and the Forest Service spent a lot of effort trying to decrease threats to grizzly bears in grazing allotments in areas occupied by grizzly bears, and was very successful in retiring a great many grazing allotments. And USDA Sheep Experiment Station stands out as a kind of a anomaly in that not only do they want to keep grazing sheep in those high mountain pastures that are now occupied by grizzly bears, but in addition, there's been mortalities of grizzly bears on the sheep station as a direct result of protecting sheep herders that were hired by the sheep station. It was determined pretty much shot and killed grizzly bear there, and there's been a number of other rumors of grizzly bears and other bears' demise once they were on the sheep station property. So that's been, an effort that has been ongoing for a number of years and continues to this day, and hopefully before I'm gone entirely, that'll be resolved, and that land will be returned to public management, and grizzly bears will occupy that area as well as other wildlife species and not domestic sheep. Greatest, there's been some other things that I worked on as part of the Yellowstone Ecosystem Subcommittee, and one was, a constant effort in trying to recover the grizzly bear that goes on today is, trying to decrease threats. And one thing we did was BLM and Dillon required outfitters to carry bear spray, and that went off a lot of angst by some people, but the outfitters didn't really balk at that, and that's been very successful for BLM. I think that really to try to continue to reduce the threats to grizzly bears, I'd like to see hunters carry bear spray in any hunting unit that is occupied by grizzly bears. I don't see a reason why not to do that. I think that's a pretty low hurdle to get across, and I'd like to see the state fish and game agencies in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming implement that.
Tim, that makes a lot of sense, especially since data from the federal government over the last decade shows conflicts between big game hunters and grizzly bears are now one of the leading causes of grizzly bear mortality. Yet you were the only director of a land managing agency in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to require outfitters to carry bear spray in grizzly bear habitat. Why do you think managers are so reluctant to take that step?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. When I talked to the Forest Service about doing that, on the Yellowstone Ecosystem Subcommittee, they felt that legally their lawyers wouldn't support them in doing that, and it was such a obvious way to reduce risk to bears that I just went ahead and did it, and there was never any question or concern about it. It was an easy thing to do, and the outfitters complied. So I really don't know why there's a reluctance. I think there might be some pushback from some folks because of the minor costs, but if you look at the price of an elk hunt on an outfitted elk hunt, it's such a minor thing to do. It really makes a lot of sense to me to do.
And it works.
Yeah, I think, bear spray is, if we can continue to try to encourage people to use, carry bear spray and hopefully not have to use it, but if they do, it's a much better alternative than protecting your elk or getting into a conflict over an elk or running into a bear during hunting season to use bear spray instead of a gun and try to reduce the mortality rate. I mean, we looked at the possibility of up to 10% of the bears in the ecosystem this year being eliminated, and that's just not sustainable. And yet we're marching on towards trying to delist the grizzly bear, and I think there's just too many risks out there to do that at this time.
I'd like to get back to that point about delisting and risk in a moment. But first, you developed a program on your district to reduce human-bear conflicts, loaning out bear-proof coolers, an electric fence, and outfitter kitchens. How well did that program work, and what kind of challenges did you face?
With BLM was lack of funding. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in its grizzly bear recovery program, had funding that they provided to the Forest Service for food storage containers and for various methods of trying to decrease conflicts with grizzly bears. BLM didn't receive any of those kind of funds, and so it was a matter of trying to go out there and put things together by talking to NGOs and requesting funding through the agency to build things like food storage containers. I had a individual in our warehouse buy the steel and construct the containers, and we placed them in some of our recreation sites after we tested them up in West Yellowstone at the Grizzly Bear Recovery Center, and so that's worked out well. We gave some to the Montana Fish and Game at one of their fishing access sites, and we put them at some of our recreation sites on the Madison. We also got some material to create some place you could hang game by attaching game poles to trees and using some metal to hold those game poles in place on the trees. We acquired some electric fencing to fence in food, acquired a kitchen unit that could be closed down and bear-proof, coolers, things like that we could loan out to outfitters and hunters to decrease the likelihood that there's going to be a food conflict. So, I mean, some of those things, it was just a matter of trying to find the funding and going out and making sure people knew that those things were available if they wanted to borrow them.
And you had a fair amount of support among people who used?
Well, we were able to get money, a little bit of money through the agency, and through some NGOs we were able to obtain funding. So it was a matter of just going out and trying to get the funding as best we could. Now, I think, those kind of opportunities are decreasing as the agency's budgets are constrained, and as we move closer towards recovery and delisting, I think those opportunities decrease because I think people think there's enough bears out there in some instances, so they're less likely to provide that kind of funding through the government.
So what about funding post-delisting? There's a discussion, obviously, now about removal of protections for grizzly bears and concerns about whether or not adequate funding will be available. What's your take on the funding issue?
Once the bears delisted, the money for trying to reduce threats is going to dry up. The agencies just aren't going to obligate the money for a species that's delisted and, according to Fish and Wildlife Service, is doing okay. So I think it's going to be much harder for the agencies to acquire the funding necessary to reduce threats. And as we know, the threats are increasing. The population growth in the Gallatin Valley, in Big Sky, increasing dramatically. It's one of the top growing regions in the country right now, population-wise. On a percentage basis, it's
right.
Amazing what's going on here. And the people are moving here for their access to public lands, and they like to hunt and fish and hike and ride bikes, and they're right in the middle of some of the areas that everyone hopes grizzly bears are moving into and expanding. And conflicts are going to be there. And we're going to see more and more human conflict, human-caused deaths, traffic, hunting. It's just going to get, more and more need for efforts to decrease threats to grizzly bears. And I don't think the money's going to be there.
Right. Do you have a sense that the states are going to be equally hit as the federal land managing agencies?
Yeah, I think, the states are going to have a harder time, spending money on a species that's recovered and there to manage. We're looking at, some pretty conservative efforts on reducing budgets and not taking federal money, and I think it's going to be difficult for the states to put a significant effort out there to a species that's theoretically, according to them, recovered.
Tim, in the years you served on the Yellowstone Grizzly Bear Subcommittee, you saw the decline of several key foods for Yellowstone grizzly bears: Yellowstone cutthroat trout, whitebark pine, Yellowstone's northern elk herd. Yet the Fish and Wildlife Service came out with a rule to delist Yellowstone grizzly bears in March, saying that bears can compensate with other foods. Can you share your perspective on this?
Well, I think a lot of the grizzly bear population gains in the Yellowstone ecosystem were made at a time when the northern elk herd was high, when whitebark pine nuts were available, and when cutthroat trout were abundant in Yellowstone Lake. And those three things just aren't there anymore. And I think, in my opinion, it seems to me that the core population in the park and protected areas like the parks, Grand Teton and Yellowstone, those bears have a harder time making a living than they did. And I think the population increase in the core area is declining, and I think those bears are moving out because of the high-protein food sources. The high-fat food sources aren't there anymore. And yes, grizzly bears will adjust and eat other things. They have to now. But I think you're pushing more bears out into areas that are less protected, and there's more threats, while we have, not enough funding to deal with those threats. The cutthroat trout population in Yellowstone Lake is never going to be like it was. There's a great effort to reduce the lake trout population, but it's not going to ever go away. And the cutthroat trout food source in Yellowstone Lake is never going to be like it was before. The northern elk herd is down from 19,000 animals in the northwestern part of the park to 4,000 animals.
Yeah.
There's almost no hunting being proposed in the northwest part of the ecosystem, such as the Gardner or Gallatin. The Gardner population is down. Those areas, you're seeing a big decrease in elk numbers, and that the availability of that high-protein food source is greatly diminished. Whitebark pine is essentially gone from much of the ecosystem. The pine nuts were a great source of high-fat food in the late summer, early fall for bears to acquire, and now that's gone. So, those are three of the dominant food sources that bears were utilizing, and I think we haven't really seen the long-term results of that because of the slow rate which bears reproduce, and we just don't know yet, I don't think, what the real impacts of all that are.
Yeah, so that's the challenge of time. Tim, you talked a bit about grizzly bear mortalities earlier, but maybe you can expand on that. So during the last 10 years, we've seen grizzly bear mortalities in the Yellowstone ecosystem increase, while according to federal estimates, the population has remained more or less flat. In 2015, 61 grizzly bears were reported to have died, 55 of them from human causes, which means that a total of 90 bears died when you apply the government's estimate of unreported deaths. So this is about 12% of the population dead. Given this kind of mortality, do you think that removing Yellowstone's grizzly bear protections is appropriate?
No, I don't think it's appropriate. I think those mortality rates aren't sustainable. The mortality rates have continued to climb since I was involved with the Yellowstone Ecosystem Subcommittee in 2002, when I first started going to those meetings and was appointed to represent BLM. I've seen those mortality rates steadily increase. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, with the increasing population, the food sources being diminished in the core area in particular, I think the risks are too high to move forward with delisting. I don't think we have, while the population theoretically could be determined to be stable, I think it's actually declining somewhat, especially in the core area, and the risks are too great.
Yeah. Tim, if you were still working and you were given the job of grizzly bear czar, what else would you do related to grizzly bears?
Well, I think there's a number of things you could do to reduce threats to grizzly bears. I think you could require, I think hunters should be required to carry bear spray in hunting units that are occupied by grizzly bears. That's not a big ask. Thousands of people acquire bear spray as they go into the parks, both Grand Teton and Yellowstone, for hiking. I don't think it's a big ask for the Fish and Game agencies in the 3 states to require hunters to carry bear spray with them when they're hunting. I just don't think that's a big request. I think there's more efforts in food storage that need to take place, that we need, more dispersal of food storage containers throughout the ecosystem. I think we need to encourage movement of grizzly bears in various areas outside of the park and try to reconnect with the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. I think until that connection is made, I don't see why we need to rush delisting at this point. I know it's a success story that the government wants to hang its hat on teeny species, but I think it's too big a risk at this point. I think we're going to be back where we were, with a decreased population, and I think we're going to be back where we were if we move ahead with if the government moves ahead with delisting. I think we're going to be back with a threatened species eventually in probably 10 years, because the population will continue to decline because the threats aren't addressed.
Interesting. Tim, would you like to expand on your views of other threats that the grizzly bears face?
Well, we've got sheep in the Gravellys, domestic sheep in the Gravellys, domestic sheep. There's still a push to get the sheep back up in the Centennials again. So those threats aren't going away, and we've lost bears because of that, and we're going to continue to see bear mortalities, but the human-caused mortality rate is so high that I just don't see delisting and then the potential for hunting bears down the road as something that is a prudent thing to do for grizzly bears.
Shifting gears, Tim, I'm interested in your perspective on the month-long armed takeover of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon last winter. And perhaps maybe on a more personal note, how did that incident affect you?
Well, I moved up here in the late 70s, largely because of the access to public land. I didn't want to live in a place that I didn't have easy access to the outdoors and public land to camp and hunt and fish on. And I think there's a lot of people that have moved into Montana and Wyoming, Idaho, in particular, other states as well in the West, for a large degree for their access to public lands. And certainly it's a big draw to the Bozeman area and others as well. And to me, it was a pretty big insult to, have spent my entire pretty much adult life working to protect public lands, manage public lands for the benefit of all the people in the United States and elsewhere, but funded by the public nationwide, and to have a small group of radical, armed people take over a wildlife refuge, and their aim being to turn over the country's public lands to ranchers, loggers, and miners who have pretty much dominated the discussion on use of public lands over the decades previous is kind of just insulting to me. The public owns those lands. They're managed for the general public, and multiple uses occur on them. Huge subsidies in ranching, timber, mining occur, as well as other things. Recreation is subsidized as well. So, to the thought of turning those over to ranchers, farmers, ranchers, loggers, and miners who have, pretty much had a huge say in the management of public lands already, just is kind of dumbfounding to me. But I was...
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would like to see more, support out of the general public as far as retaining public lands. But the polls that have been taken, especially in Montana, show over 60% favor retaining federal ownership of public lands. The state can't manage those lands. The state manages for a profit for the school trusts. And the federal government does not manage for a profit. It subsidizes the livestock industry, the mining industry, the oil and gas industry, and timber sales are done at below cost, and grazing is $1.65 an animal unit month, and on state land it's 5 times that, at least. And private grazing is over $20 to $25 an animal unit month. So there's a huge grazing subsidy. The individuals who have those federal grazing permits don't want the land because, they can graze it for next to nothing. So there's no support there. The timber industry doesn't support it because they know the cost of timber goes up when the state puts up a timber sale compared to BLM or the Forest Service. So.
Right. Tim, does it surprise you that more people were not rallying behind the cause of public lands at that time?
Yeah, it did. I thought there would be more of an outcry of support I know eventually there was more in Oregon. There were individuals, but I think they were afraid. I think there's a fear of those individuals that are, pretty radical, armed, and, I think there's a lot of people out there who quietly support the public lands and federal ownership, but just aren't vocal about it.
Right.
Hopefully they'll vote for their public lands come November.
I hope so. At least the choice is ours then. Well, thank you so much, Tim. Well, this is Louisa Wilcox with the Grizzly Beat, here with Tim Bozorth, former director of the Bureau of Land Management in Dillon, Montana, and member of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. Thank you very much.